On June 22, 1941, the skies over Eastern Europe roared with the roar of 3 million German soldiers advancing toward the Soviet Union. It was the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. But how did it come about? And how would that invasion lead the way to one of the bloodiest battles ever fought, the Battle of Stalingrad? To understand this crucial moment, we must first go back a couple of years, to August 23, 1939. That day, in a closed negotiating room, two irreconcilable enemies signed a pact that would shake the foundations of Europe. The Pact of No German-Soviet Aggression, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This agreement, presented as a simple non-aggression treaty, hid a dark secret: the partition of Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia would be Soviet, while Poland would be divided in two, separated by the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers. The pact was nothing more than a disguised truce. Hitler considered it a temporary strategy to prepare his real objective: destroy the Soviet Union and convert its vast territories into colonies of the Third Reich. The German machine was set in motion. First, they subjugated Poland in a matter of weeks. Then, in 1940, France fell. With the West seemingly controlled, Hitler set his sights on the East. In his mind, conquering the Soviet Union was not a question of if, but of when. On June 22, 1941, the silence of dawn was broken by Operation Barbarossa, a lightning invasion with more than 3 million German and Allied soldiers advancing from Finland to the Black Sea. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet Union would fall first, before winter arrived. However, what began as an overwhelming advance quickly turned into a nightmare for Germany. Soviet resistance in key cities such as Leningrad and Sevastopol, along with a surprise counteroffensive in Moscow, slowed the German momentum. But Hitler, stubborn and determined, refused to stop. He changed his objective: the oil wells of the Caucasus, vital to feed the Nazi war machine. Thus was born Operation Blue, a desperate plan to capture the resources of the Soviet South. But this decision would take the Germans directly to the gates of Stalingrad. What Hitler didn't know was that Stalingrad wouldn't be just another city on the map. It would be the place where his dream of global domination would begin to crumble. In the summer of 1942, as the sun scorched the vast steppes of southern Russia, the German war machine prepared for a new assault. This time, the target was not Moscow, but the industrial heartland of the Volga, Stalingrad. But what should have been a quick and decisive blow turned into a storm of strategic errors that would forever change the course of World War II. Operation Blue, conceived to capture the vital oil wells of the Caucasus and secure the resources of the Third Reich, had a clear plan: advance from Voronezh towards the Volga and the Caucasus, with the 6th Army of Friedrich Paulus and the 4th Panzer Army of Hermann Hoth leading the charge. But from the beginning, things did not go as expected. General Paulus, recently appointed commander of the 6th Army, had presented an initial plan to consolidate the lines in Kharkiv, but his movements were interrupted by a fierce Soviet counteroffensive led by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. With 640,000 troops and 1,200 tanks, the Soviets. They attempted to encircle the German forces in a pincer movement. For days, the 6th Army was on the verge of collapse. Only the intervention of the 1st Panzer Army, under the command of Ewald von Kleist, saved the situation. Instead of being captured, Paulus helped capture 240,000 Soviet soldiers, a severe blow to the Red Army. But this momentary victory did not hide the structural problems of the campaign. On June 28, 1942, the offensive began in the direction of Voronezh, but, obsessed by rapid advance, Hitler made a decision that would prove fatal. He divided Army Group South into two separate forces. Force A was to advance towards the Caucasus, while Force B, with the 6th Army and part of the 4th Panzer Army, was to head towards Stalingrad. The problem was not only the division of forces, but Hitler's constantly changing orders, which confused and slowed down the army's movements. The situation worsened when a German plane carrying confidential information about the operation was shot down and fell into the hands of Soviet forces. Although Stalin dismissed the documents as a distraction, strategic chaos had already begun. As the German forces approached Stalingrad, attrition became evident. Troops were exhausted, fuel was scarce, and the confused movements of mechanized units made progress difficult. But Hitler, determined to capture the Caucasus and the Volga simultaneously, he was not willing to listen to his generals. For the Soviets, the city named after Stalin was not just a strategic point. It was a symbol of resistance, and losing it was not an option. In August 1942, with German troops at the gates of Stalingrad, Stalin designated Andrei Yermolenko as commander of the Stalingrad front, marking the beginning of a defense that would go down in history. What neither side knew was that Stalingrad would not be a simple battle. It would be an inferno that would redefine the meaning of total war. On August 21, 1942, Axis forces finally reached the gates of Stalingrad. What until then was a vibrant city with its factories and streets full of life became the scene of one of the most dangerous bombings. In just 48 hours, Stalingrad was reduced to an apocalyptic landscape of smoke and rubble. The German offensive was advancing with relentless ferocity. From the Don River, Friedrich Paulus's German 6th Army had crossed quickly and reached the Volga River in less than 12 hours. Morale among the German soldiers was high. They were confident of victory. Rapid, that would seal the fate of the Soviet Union. But this confidence was dangerous. To the south, General Hoth's troops of the 4th Panzer Army were advancing more slowly, facing fierce resistance from the Red Army commanded by Andrei Yermolenko. The latter had concentrated his forces in that area, and, to further complicate matters, to make matters worse, Hitler had weakened Hoth by removing a crucial armored corps. At the end of August, as the German lines approached the horizon of Stalingrad, General Georgy Zhukov, newly appointed Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet forces, arrived in the city. Zhukov did not come alone. With him came the 62nd and the 64th DIG armies, forces exhausted but determined to resist. At that time, the situation was desperate, and Stalin knew that losing Stalingrad meant more than a strategic defeat. If Stalingrad falls, Stalin warned, the south of the country will be lost. Our most important waterway will be in the hands of the enemy, and with it, the oil we need to survive. Zhukov made quick and bold decisions. He replaced General Anton Lopatin in command of the 62nd Army with General Vasily Chuikov, a man known for his indomitable character and his willingness to fight to the end. Chuikov soon showed why he was the suitable man for the moment. Under his command, thousands of women were integrated into the defenses of Stalingrad as snipers, anti-aircraft artillery operators, messengers, and nurses. As the Soviet people transformed every corner of the city into a battlefield, Zhukov's order was clear: do not surrender Stalingrad. Every street, every factory, every meter of land became a trench. For the defenders, there was no other option but to resist. But while the Soviets defended with everything they had, Friedrich Paulus, commanding the German 6th Army, saw with growing concern the fragility of his flanks. The troops guarding his lines were not German. They were Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian, badly equipped and vulnerable. Although Paulus knew that this weakness could cost him dearly, Hitler refused to listen to his warnings. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad was not just a military objective. It was a symbol. But that obsession would lead him to make mistakes that would mark the beginning of the end for his ambitions in the East. Thus, in the ruins of Stalingrad, a battle began that would not only decide the fate of the city, but also that of the war in Europe. September 14, 1942. The German assault on Stalingrad begins. For the soldiers of Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, this was the final stage of a brutal campaign. But what awaited them in the city was not an easy victory, but an urban hell that would consume them. Stalin, knowing that he could not afford to lose control of the Volga, called up the 13th Guards Rifle Division, led by the ruthless Alexander Rodimtsev. These men, hardened veterans of the war, were tasked with containing the German advance at any cost. Supported by the Soviet 8th Air Force, Rodimtsev and his men fought fiercely. But the city was already in total chaos. Every neighborhood, every street, and every building became a battlefield, where death lurked around every corner. On September 15th, Soviet reinforcements began to arrive from Siberia and Mongolia. But, despite their initial numerical advantage, German troops began to succumb to the yoke of Soviet snipers, who turned every step into a lethal risk. By mid-month, 8 of the German Sixth Army's 20 divisions were locked in fierce fighting inside the city. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued to reinforce their lines, sending in men and resources at an unstoppable pace. Friedrich Paulus, weakened by dysentery and pressured by the top Nazi hierarchies, began to show signs of exhaustion. A nervous twitch in his left eye soon spread to his entire face, reflecting the physical and mental wear and tear to which he was subjected. Although Soviet casualties were at least twice those of the Germans, Paulus's manpower was rapidly depleted. Only one reserve division remained, while German soldiers, ill-prepared for urban combat, faced constant ambushes in terrain where every corner could hide death. The night, far from offering rest, became the favorite scene of the Soviets. The night attacks kept the German troops in constant tension, while the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain control of the air. But the Soviet bombers did not stop, unloading 400-kilogram bombs on German positions even in darkness. The German Sixth Army, exhausted and on the verge of collapse, begged the Luftwaffe to keep up the pressure on Soviet aviation throughout the night. Without rest, without respite, the German soldiers were beginning to realize that Stalingrad would not fall easily. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a symbol. For some, the glory of the Reich. For others, the last line of defense of their homeland. And so, in the ruins of the city, one of the darkest chapters was written of World War II. Stalingrad was not a conventional battle. For the German and Soviet soldiers, it became a desperate, face-to-face fight in a scene of ruin and death. This was the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. If night bombing and ambushes were not enough, Soviet snipers took it upon themselves to spread terror among German officers. Every shot, every casualty was a reminder that not a moment was safe. Premature promotions became common, while the officers fell one after another. The tension at Stalingrad was unsustainable. Each soldier was under constant psychological pressure. But neurosis or even exhaustion were not acceptable options. The top commanders on both sides did not recognize these conditions, and cowardice was punished by death. Immediate execution. The rules of war changed completely at Stalingrad. German heavy artillery, powerful in open fields, became useless in the destroyed streets. Attacking a house occupied by enemies meant, almost always, risking the lives of your own troops in buildings nearby. General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, adapted his strategy. He ordered artillery to be moved to the eastern bank of the Volga, from where he would attack the German lines of communication. But to guide these attacks, Soviet officers had to expose themselves in the rooftops, a suicidal movement under the watch of German snipers. Only the feared Katyusha rocket launchers remained in the city, hidden among the sandbanks of the Volga. These devices, known as Stalin's organs, brought chaos and destruction wherever they hit. While the Soviets defended every corner of Stalingrad, the command posts were so close to the front that there was no rest. On one occasion, a German tank blocked the entrance to a Soviet artillery commander's bunker. With no other options, the personnel had to dig desperately to save themselves. Despite their technical and strategic superiority, German troops could not overcome the fierce resistance on a battlefield designed, by its very destruction, to be defended. Every street, every building became a fortress. The combined attacks of infantry and armor were useless in this urban chaos. The smell of death permeated the air. The corpses of both sides decomposed under the rubble, creating a Dantesque scene. Pestilence and disease soon became another enemy in this infernal battle. And even in the midst of this horror, Nazi ideology was still present. The remaining Jews in Stalingrad were persecuted with the same ferocity as the armed enemy, reflecting the Reich's relentless anti-Semitic policy. Stalingrad was not only a battle of weapons, but of wills. For some, the glory of the Reich. For others, the survival of a nation. And in this hell, the destiny of the Second World War was forged. By the end of September 1942, Stalingrad was not only a battlefield, it was hell on earth. The ruins of the city were marked by death, hunger, and human suffering, for both combatants and civilians, caught between the sides. The Feldgendarmerie, the German military police, not only fought against Soviet soldiers, they also captured civilians suitable for forced labor. Thousands of Jews were murdered by the Sonderkommandos of the Einsatzgruppen, while another 60,000 were sent to Germany as slaves. By the 15th, by September, these squads had killed nearly 4,000 civilians, including children, before withdrawing from Stalingrad. With winter rapidly approaching, General Paulus knew that time was against him. On September 27th, he launched a massive offensive to take the city, focusing on the Red October and Barricade factories and the strategic Mamayev-Kurgan Hill. The result was catastrophic for civilians trying to escape the chaos. German soldiers shot at those fleeing towards their lines, considering them a possible threat. No one was safe. Amid the horror, fighting intensified around the House of Specialists, a key building captured by the Germans. From there, troops fired on Soviet boats crossing the Volga to reinforce resistance. Meanwhile, the anti-aircraft guns, Stukas, and German artillery competed to sink the ships. The Caspian Sea soon began to fill with corpses. Between September 27th and 28th, casualties were overwhelming. The Germans lost 2,500 men in just 2 days, while Soviet forces suffered almost 6,000 casualties daily. For the defenders of Stalingrad, the loss was unimaginable. The number of deaths were piling up, and the entire city was enveloped in an unbearable stench. Despite enormous casualties, the Germans managed to capture 75% of Stalingrad, including most of the industrial districts. However, the partial victory came at a cost. The soldiers were exhausted, resources were limited, and winter was approaching. Closer and closer. Interestingly, not all Soviet soldiers remained loyal to their cause. Some defected to the German side, known as Hiwis. Although they did not play a prominent role, at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad it is estimated that around 50,000 Hiwis died, a figure that it shows how complicated this war of survival was. The offensive of September 1942 was not only a fight for territory, but also a battle for humanity itself. The tragedy of Stalingrad was written in every life lost, in every building destroyed, and in every decision made in the midst of chaos. But winter was about to arrive, and with it, a new stage of this brutal conflict. By October 1942, Stalingrad was almost completely under German control. Almost. Although 80% of the city was occupied by Axis forces, the Volga River docks remained a Soviet stronghold. From there, troops and supplies continued to arrive, keeping Red Resistance alive. German attempts to take the docks ended in tragedy. Battalions sent to capture them were massacred, with losses of up to 50% of their strength. Meanwhile, strategic factories such as Red October and Barricade had fallen, and Soviet casualties reached terrifying figures: 4,000 men a day. Hitler and his generals soon understood that taking the city before winter was an impossible task. However, staying in Stalingrad meant facing a new enemy: the freezing temperatures that hovered around minus 18 degrees Celsius. The harsh winter began to take its toll. Diseases such as typhus and dysentery spread rapidly among the German troops, further weakening an already exhausted army. But there was an even greater threat approaching from the horizon. On the Siberian steppes, the Soviet High Command was preparing Operation Uranus, a bold maneuver designed to envelop and encircle the German Sixth Army. With more than 1.7 million soldiers, 200 divisions, tanks and guns amassed, the plan was a pincer attack against the weaker flanks of the Axis, defended by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces. Initially, Stalin hesitated to reduce supplies to the Soviet 62nd Army defending the city, but he eventually supported the encirclement plan, a risky but necessary strategy to reverse the situation on the southern front. As Operation Uranus took shape, something peculiar was happening in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. During the freezing nights, the fighting came to an almost complete halt. Groups on both sides, exhausted by the endless carnage, improvised unofficial truces. Makeshift white flags flew from the ruins to allow both sides to collect their dead. In some cases, they even exchanged basic supplies in these spontaneous truces, a reminder that behind the uniform, they were all human beings facing the same hell. But the truce was fragile and temporary. The battle would continue, and the Soviet encirclement was rapidly approaching. Stalingrad, covered in a white blanket, was preparing for the most brutal chapter of this devastating contest. November 19, 1942. Early in the morning, the sky over the white steppes of Stalingrad was filled with the deafening echo of more than 3,500 Soviet guns. The target, the weak Romanian and Italian lines protecting the flanks of the Sixth German Army. Under the freezing mist, Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers and howitzers mercilessly bombarded the Axis positions. After an hour of relentless destruction, the rifle battalions advanced. With their trumpets blaring like a death signal, the Siberian soldiers marched towards enemy lines, followed by the unstoppable T-34 tanks. The Romanian and Italian defenders fought bravely, but were woefully underprepared to meet the onslaught. Without sufficient anti-tank weapons and surrounded by snow, their fortifications were demolished one by one. As the tanks advanced, the survivors broke ranks, and they fled desperately across the White Plain, pursued mercilessly by Soviet troops. General Paulus and the commanders of the German Sixth Army did not take reports of the initial attack seriously. Their attention remained focused on the fighting inside Stalingrad. But by the time they understood the magnitude of the offensive, it was too late. On the southern flank, the Soviet advance was equally devastating. Although they faced isolated counterattacks, the Red columns continued to advance, converging toward a strategic point, the small town of Kalak and its bridge over the Don River. This crucial crossing, which housed workshops and German supply depots, was not prepared to resist. On November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers met at Kalak, completing the encirclement of the Sixth Army. More than 250,000 German soldiers were trapped inside Stalingrad, without supplies, without reinforcements, and with an implacable enemy stalking them from all sides, the disaster was total. Operation Uranus, a risky but meticulously planned maneuver, had locked in one of Germany's most powerful forces. Stalingrad had become a death trap, and the war in the East was about to change for always. November 24, 1942. The German Sixth Army, with 250,000 men, was completely surrounded in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. Instead of authorizing a retreat to save his soldiers, Adolf Hitler issued a blunt order: not a single step back. The German High Command's plan to escape to the Don River was still possible, but was rejected by Hitler, who dreamed of an airlift that would keep the fighting in Stalingrad alive. Inspired by the success of the Demyansk Stock Exchange months earlier, he confided blindly on the promise of Marshal Hermann Göring. Göring claimed that the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies a day to the besieged army, but the reality was devastating. Snowstorms, extreme temperatures, and Soviet attacks reduced shipments to less than 130 tons in 3 days. The logistics of the airlift collapsed quickly. General von Richthofen, commanding the air forces in the region, knew the mission was impossible. Key airfields, such as Pitomnik, were attacked and destroyed by the Soviets, leaving the Sixth Army with no hope of resupply. While snow, hunger, and despair were beginning to take over the German soldiers trapped in the hell of Stalingrad. The shortages were brutal. Men began to starve. Despair was growing among the troops. In December 1942, discipline was still barely maintained, but casualties from hunger and disease were inevitable. Meanwhile, Hitler continued obsessed with maintaining the city at all costs. The decision to keep the Sixth Army at Stalingrad sealed its fate. The cauldron, as it was called, was not just a physical encirclement, but a death sentence for thousands of men. With each passing day, the encirclement, the Soviet Union was becoming more ruthless, and hope was fading among the trapped soldiers. Paulus's Sixth Army faced a tragedy unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. The Stalingrad cauldron not only destroyed one of the Third Reich's most powerful forces, it marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich's ambitions: Hitler in the East. After the Soviet siege, Stalingrad became a real cauldron, der Kessel. Without water, sufficient food, or medicine, the German troops were subjected to a merciless siege. Diseases and the stench of death permeated every corner. For Hitler, however, the only option was to resist. In a symbolic act, he promoted General Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal, suggesting that he should follow the German tradition, die rather than surrender. But Paulus, after observing firsthand the extreme suffering of his men, decided he would not follow that path. He forbade his officers from taking their own lives, stating that they would share the fate of his soldiers. Despite Göring's promises to supply the Sixth Army from the airlift was a complete failure. The airfields at Pitomnik and later Gumrak became unusable after constant Soviet attacks, leaving troops reduced to receiving occasional boxes of supplies dropped by parachute. In an ironic and tragic twist, many of these supplies fell into Soviet hands, into the Volga River, or were lost in the rubble of the city. Meanwhile, the situation in the siege became unsustainable. In January 1943, temperatures were around minus 30 degrees Celsius, rations were minimal, and corpses were piled up in the streets. Hopes were fading quickly. In December 1942, a ray of hope illuminated the gloomy situation of the Sixth Army. Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Dawn, launched Operation Winter Storm. This offensive sought to break the Soviet encirclement from two fronts: Shir and Kotelnikovo, more than 160 kilometers from Stalingrad. German tanks advanced in initial force, but the Soviets responded with a fierce defense. On December 16th, the Second Guard Army blocked the offensive just 50 kilometers from its objective, destroying most of the 400 German tanks involved. Faced with pressure from Soviet counterattacks, Manstein had no choice but to order a withdrawal. The failure of this operation sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. With no hope of reinforcements or supplies, the Soviet encirclement tightened even more. The Sasinskaya airfield, one of the last key supply bases, fell into Soviet hands, leaving the Sixth Army completely isolated. The winter became unbearable for the trapped Germans. On the Kessel, more than 1,000 soldiers died daily from cold, hunger, and disease. By Christmas 1942, the Soviets intensified their psychological siege. They celebrated the New Year on the south bank of the Volga with banquets, fireworks, and music, a spectacle designed not only to celebrate, but to mentally torture the encircled Germans. Paulus, previously an ardent follower of Hitler, began to understand that for the Führer, the Sixth Army was nothing more than a disposable piece on his warboard. As the days progressed and conditions worsened, surrender became inevitable. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets further narrowed the Kessel perimeter and captured Pitomnik, the last functional airfield. The Germans, in their desperation, tried to rehabilitate the already severely damaged Gumrak airfield, but logistics barely allowed it to be kept operational. The next day, 2 Soviet officers showed up at the German lines with an ultimatum from the Stavka: surrender or face an all-out offensive. Paulus rejected the offer, and with this, condemned his army to face the final offensive. As conditions worsened, German troops suffered complete degradation. Hunger led soldiers to sacrifice horses, dogs, and even rats to survive. Epidemics, such as typhus and dysentery, spread uncontrollably. However, despite the logistical and health collapse, German resistance remained fierce. The front lines were slowly retreating, fighting and causing significant casualties among the Soviets executing the Ring Plan, designed to crush the Sixth Army. On January 28th, Paulus moved his headquarters to the basements of the Univermag, a department store in the city center. Nearly 3,000 wounded people were crowded there, many of them in critical condition. Due to lack of resources, serious cases were abandoned outside to die of cold. 2 days later, Hitler sent a clear message to Paulus. As newly appointed Field Marshal, he should commit suicide, since no German marshal had ever surrendered. However, Paulus disobeyed. On January 31st, a Soviet tank arrived at the gates of Univermag. On board was an interpreter sent by Paulus himself, Major Baer, who negotiated the terms of surrender. Paulus capitulated that same day along with the remains of his army. 90,000 soldiers, of which only 5,000 survived Soviet captivity to return to Germany after the war. For the first time in history, a German field marshal surrendered, setting an unprecedented precedent in the Wehrmacht. On February 2nd, the last German soldiers entrenched in the ruins of the Red October factory also surrendered, officially ending the Battle of Stalingrad. The surrender of the German Sixth Army had consequences of devastating proportions. Officially, 91,000 German soldiers became prisoners, but most did not survive captivity due to harsh conditions and epidemics. Only 6,000 returned to Germany after the war. The human and material losses were irreparable for the Third Reich. More than 200,000 Axis fighters, including experienced troops of the Sixth Army and part of the 4th Panzer Army, were lost in combat. The Wehrmacht was left without logistical resources to maintain an offensive in the east, marking the furthest point that German troops would reach in the Soviet Union. The failure of Göring's promised airlift undermined his prestige in the Nazi regime, weakening his position before Hitler and the German High Command. For the Soviets, although the victory was monumental, the price was also very high. According to the highest estimates, 1,850,000 Soviet casualties, including dead, wounded, and prisoners, both military and civilian. The city of Stalingrad was completely devastated, with thousands of civilians killed in the fighting or the siege. Globally, more than 2 million people, including military and civilians, died in the battle. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad transcended the military sphere. It was a turning point in the war, not only on the Eastern Front but also in the spirit of the Allies. The Soviet Union emerged as an unstoppable power that had dealt a decisive blow to the Axis, marking the beginning of its counteroffensive towards Berlin. The impact of the battle resonated throughout the world. In England, King George VI presented Stalingrad with a ceremonial sword in recognition of his heroism. The Chilean poet Pablo Neruda celebrated this victory with his poems Love Song to Stalingrad and New Love Song to Stalingrad, immortalizing the Soviet resistance as a symbol of hope for all peoples occupied by fascism. Stalingrad became a historical milestone, a battle that not only marked the decline of the Third Reich, but inspired oppressed nations to resist. His legacy continues to be a reminder of sacrifice and resilience in the midst of the most extreme adversity.